Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Michael, and I hope you're doing alright. In this video, I'll initiate a discussion on a subject I'm extremely passionate about. My whole interest in this video's topic initially sparked from a realization I had that touchscreen technology inherently had the power to completely revolutionize the specialized electronic music hardware industry. The subject of this video is going to be about the potential of the iPad Pro to catapult us into a new paradigm when it comes to electronic music production technology. With that said, many of the ideas I'll be discussing throughout the video have nothing to do with the iPad in particular. The video is mainly about raising people's awareness to the meta implications of this technology, as so far I really haven't been getting the sense that people on a large scale have connected the dots, specifically when it comes down to highly responsive touchscreen technology in the context of electronic music production. This video is the second edition to a new video series concept I've been wanting to play with on my channel, especially now that I've had the opportunity to gain more experience since I started making videos on YouTube. The Real Talk and Chill video series focuses on discussing potentially more abstract subjects related to music and technology in general. I feel like some of these subjects have a real potential to profoundly impact our music exploration journey as electronic music creators. I'll begin the talk by giving some context based on my perspective, specifically regarding the evolution of touchscreen technology. It's no secret that the release of the first iPhone in 2007 was the beginning of a massive technological revolution that exposed the entire world to highly responsive touchscreen technology. Right away, there's an opportunity to acknowledge the fact that 2007 was actually not that long ago. The iPad was then released in early 2010, and so that's only 14 years ago. So if we look at the technological progress that has emerged on the hardware front over these last 14 years, the difference in performance with what we have access to today compared to what we had back then is actually mind-boggling. The first iPad had a single-core CPU capable of reaching a speed of 1 gigahertz, and it included 256 megabytes of RAM. 14 years later, the M4 iPad Pro is a device that runs on a 10 cores CPU with up to 4 performance cores, 6 efficiency cores, and has up to 16 gigabytes of RAM. The performance cores are capable of reaching an unfathomable 4.4 gigahertz speed on a tablet that has a fanless design. Yeah. Really let that sink in. Purely from a hardware standpoint, take the time to compare the iPad with every single piece of music hardware you have. Consider whether your equipment is digital, analog, or probably even both, and consider the potential of that equipment while taking into account the physical space it occupies compared to a device like the M4 iPad Pro, which is marginally larger than a Digitact. Unless you own some exotic, very specialized, and probably analog high-end equipment, there's a very strong probability that the hardware you own has been rendered obsolete to a very significant extent due to the existence of the M4 iPad Pro, at least on paper. If you guys watched Apple's M4 iPad Pro release event, you already know that they received significantly negative feedback from the community for depicting a massive hydraulic press crushing a bunch of hardware equipment, only to reveal an iPad Pro at the end of the process, right at the center of the press. While I certainly found the efforts deployed to film that demonstration of destruction quite disgusting, I completely understood the thought that generated the concept of their video, because objectively there's a lot of truth to what is depicted, which is that the iPad has now reached a critical point in its evolution where it can already replace a lot of the typical equipment used in electronic music production, some of which took a lot of physical space and implied a very large price tag. It's obvious that the reality is a lot more nuanced than what Apple showed in that launch video, but it's undeniable that today, virtually contained within my M2 iPad Pro, I have more synth instruments, sound processors, and sequencers that I can interact with on a tactile level than all the gear I could ever fit in my apartment. I don't have to struggle with cable connections. I don't have to deal with the lack of physical space at my desk or bad ergonomics due to the logistics challenges of putting a bunch of bulky gear together. I don't have to struggle with gear breaking down over time and repair costs. I don't have to sacrifice being in the sweet spot of my studio monitors just because I want to play a keyboard synth that's at a perpendicular angle to my desk without headphones. And lastly, very importantly, I also get to use multiple instances of the same instruments thanks to AUV3 plugin technology, on top of having access to massive polyphony and multi-timbrality. With the software that's on my iPad Pro, I can get results that largely surpass what I could get on most dedicated pieces of digital or analog hardware at a fraction of the cost. Just to give you a rough estimate, assuming that the M4 iPad Pro costs $1,000 US and that the necessary accessories add about $200 extra, if I add $21 for AUM, $30 for a premium synth, $3 for literally the best MIDI virtual control surface on iPad, which is AU keys by the way, $30 for the FabFilter Pro C2 compressor, $25 for Saturn II, $25 for Volcano 3 or even Pro Q3, $20 for tape, $6 for Shaper 2, $30 for a good reverb, $10 for a delay, $10 for a chorus, $20 for a sequencer. That adds up to about $230 US, but that amount could realistically be estimated to something that's about as low as $160 if the user was to buy all the relevant software at the right time. I'm actually going to assume that a buyer who would consider the iPad Pro specifically for music production would most likely manage to get significant discounts because the software discounts on iOS tend to be very substantial when they occur, and we have access to websites that allow us to track pricing history and to anticipate discount timings and rarity. Apple has now also set a precedent for offering a substantial App Store credit on Black Friday with the purchase of an iPad Pro, based on what I experienced in November 2023 when I bought mine. Anyhow, that takes us to about $1,360 US. And actually, let's take that down to $1,300 just for simplicity's sake. So with that $1,300 device, and assuming the user knows what they're doing, they would roughly be operational to make music. They would be able to leverage the incredible potential of being able to run multiple instances of the same premium virtual instruments and audio processors on their tablet device. They would also be able to interact with these tools in a potentially very immersive and tactile way, which is one of the major reasons that make the iPad Pro platform so special. In addition to this, most, if not all, software purchases are transposable to other potential iPads and iPhones that users already own at no additional cost, which effectively dramatically improves the efficiency of instruments and audio processor software purchases. It also opens up the door to massively enhancing the appeal of older Apple devices, as I demonstrate with the inclusion of my iPhone 12 mini as a permanent core element of my setup. The inherent intangible nature of the product and the fact that this software is effectively decoupled from the hardware means that the software portion of the user's investment is protected in case they lose access to their iPad for whatever reason. Keep in mind that realistically, in the medium to long term, it's very easy to hit the $1,000 ballpark when buying exclusively music production related apps on iOS at their discounted rate. Obviously, that $1,000 number is much larger than the $160 estimate I calculated earlier. But this really goes to show the volume of viable virtual instruments that are worthy of interest on the platform in, the context of electronic music production. What this shows is the incredible potential of the iOS platform to scale with users' budgets, interests, and needs. Generally speaking, aside from setups that are based on a PC or a Mac, none of the typical hardware music equipment gives users access to the ability to scale the complexity of their setup with their needs on the fly to this extent and with this level of flexibility. What we now have access to is a very compact piece of music hardware with a format that is truly immersive, as opposed to the typical PC Mac based DAW setup. And the iPad Pro implies a level of technological advancement that is so far ahead of everything else that's available in today's market that there is effectively nothing that can aspire to compete with it in the foreseeable future. When we look at the estimated cost of $1,300 for this iPad Pro setup and consider the kind of power and potential that the device offers, it should be overwhelmingly obvious by now that it's just a matter of time until music hardware companies end up having to dramatically redirect the focus of the products they develop so that they're aligned and properly integrated with the iPad. The implication could be that these companies would shift their business model towards providing compact hardware devices that complement and augment the iPad with controls that have a level of reliability and resistance to user input error that the iPad cannot be expected to have. Electron has already managed to achieve this to a very significant extent with their Digitact, even though there's still significant room for improvement in terms of audio routing flexibility between the iPad and the Electron boxes that are class-compliant audio interfaces. Music companies with larger footprints might also choose to simply redirect their efforts towards developing premium software for the iPad, which would be a very efficient approach to completely change the current software meta on the iPad as well. Realistically though, keep in mind that, as I've discussed in my first Real Talk and Chill video, there is still a very significant problem for large businesses with the iOS platform due to Apple's current 30% cut when it comes down to software sales. People can absolutely debate that this is actually a problem, as there's a very strong argument to be made that would consist in saying that companies could always shift that 30% loss back to the consumer. However, intuitively, in practice, I'm personally convinced that things are not as simple as that, because a large portion of the appeal of the platform has to do with the affordability of the software, and this effectively results in a democratization of people's access to viable music production technology on a global scale. So if all of a sudden every developer decides to jack their prices up by 30%, the market, which is still in its infancy stage, will inevitably shrink significantly, simply because people will no longer be able to afford the tools available on the platform. Ultimately, this 30% tax is really damaging to the growth of the platform, but the technological canyon between the iPad Pro and the rest is inevitably going to overpower this problem sooner or later. Anyhow, moving on. At the beginning of the talk, I said that the subject wasn't really about the iPad, but that's objectively pretty much all that I've been talking about up to this point. So, what I meant to imply from the beginning is that what truly matters is the combination of key elements in the context of highly responsive touchscreen technology. In other words, what matters is the combination of 1. Software that has a user interface optimized for touchscreens. 2. Having access to a highly responsive, ultra-low latency touchscreen that is fully compatible and optimized for a seamless integration with the software. 3. Having access to a critical mass of computational power to really be able to leverage touchscreen technology in the context of music production. And 4. Having access to software that's refined enough to reveal the fullest extent of the impact that this combination of key elements can actually have on changing the technological paradigm we are currently in on a large scale. Again, in the context of electronic music production. Moving on, it's important to acknowledge that yes, it's obviously going to be very difficult for a competitor to provide compelling value in a context where users on iOS can buy software at a relatively low cost and dramatically expand the efficiency of their investment, because on iOS it's expected that users can run the software they buy on multiple Apple devices at once. This typically applies to iPhones and iPads, but in some instances it can also extend to Mac computers as well. We also have to be mindful of the fact that Apple has been completely dominant in the pro audio field since pretty much forever, and consider that touchscreen compatible software available within the Apple ecosystem has had at least a 12 years lead, during which the platform has had time to mature significantly. Intuitively, it's easy to understand that for a new player, developing a touchscreen-based product in the context of the existence of the iPad Pro is an extremely challenging thing to accomplish, but it is by no means impossible, mainly because the touchscreen wouldn't necessarily need to internally carry the computational power that a viable potential concept could be reliant on. This dramatically alleviates the difficulty of the technical challenges that would come with developing such a product. It's also not necessarily mandatory that the overall concept of the instrument would need to be something other than a self-contained product when it comes down to the software that a potential touchscreen-based instrument would rely on, at least in the short to medium term. It's perfectly reasonable to imagine a scenario in which a competitor would emerge with a tablet design that would be completely dependent on a connection to either a MacBook Pro or a PC, for example, in order to have access to the computational power it would need in the context of an electronic music production instrument. That competitor could potentially develop a largely self-contained system where the user would be strictly reliant on interacting with the tablet throughout the entirety of the critical music making process, hence addressing the whole problem of having to look at a screen at a distance and having to deal with a mouse and a keyboard, which is what drove so many of us away from using a traditional computer-based DAW setup to make music to begin with. The last topic I wanted to touch on in this talk is the actual pragmatic implications of having access to touchscreen technology in the context of electronic music production. What I'm about to explain might be very obvious for some viewers, but I'm convinced there are many people out there that haven't connected the dots yet as to what makes ultra-low latency touchscreen technology so special in the context of electronic music production. The main controls that we find in today's hardware instruments are either endless rotary encoders, such as the knobs found on the Digitact, for example, potentiometers, such as the knobs you would typically find on a Moog analog hardware synthesizer, for example, and lastly, faders, which are the controls typically found in hardware mixers to control volumes. Out of these three control structures, by far the most efficient is the endless encoder, because it allows users to control large banks of parameters without having to manually, physically readjust the position of the knob when switching between banks of parameters. This is because an endless encoder physically has no beginning or end point to stop it from being turned in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction. Again, here the electron digitact perfectly exemplifies this. Potentiometers have the advantage of being very linear and reliably precise on a tactile level in the context of live performance use in particular. However, in order for potentiometers to match the level of flexibility that endless encoders bring, these potentiometers would have to be motorized, which is extremely costly. As an example, relatively recently, the company Melbourne Instruments started releasing analog synth instruments with motorized knobs. Just to give you one example, there's the Nina model, which is a 12 voices, 4 parts multi-timbral analog synth module, currently listed on B&H Photo Video's website at $3,599 US. In parallel to this comparison between endless encoders and potentiometers, faders are subjected to the same flexibility drawbacks as potentiometers, which again is a drawback that can be overcome by implementing motorized faders, which once again is extremely costly. Hopefully by now you should be starting to get the idea of where I'm going with this, but I'll make things super obvious for the sake of clarity. While, yes, a touchscreen based instrument cannot be expected to have the same level of premium tactile control experience that a hardware instrument like the Nina would give, an iPad Pro represents a fraction of the cost and has zero risk of breaking down due to mechanical wear, and it enables users to control overwhelmingly more parameters in the context of a device that occupies very limited physical space. The maturity that the iOS platform has acquired over the last 12 years has resulted in the emergence of a very specific design approach amongst premium software developers such as Iceworks, also known as Ice Gear outside of the App Store, where in order to make moderately fine parameter adjustments, users could rely on vertical dragging gestures on knobs, whereas significantly finer adjustments could be reliably achieved using horizontal dragging gestures on knobs instead. By carefully calibrating the sensitivity of the way with which parameter values or parameter value adjustments respond to dragging gestures, either on the horizontal axis or on the vertical axis, it has now been proven that it is possible to reach some sort of a sweet spot where controlling parameters on the iPad's touchscreen surface in the context of electronic music production is perfectly reliable and comfortable. With that said, a touchscreen interface will always inherently remain more prone to triggering functions unintentionally. This weakness can be compensated to some extent with an intelligent user interface design on the software side and by bringing in hardware devices to complement the iPad, such as the Digitact once again, but you get the idea. It could also be a FaderFox MIDI controller device, for example, which would really elevate the flexibility and overall comfort level of an iPad Pro based setup. As far as controlling instruments for playing notes, aside from the current significant weakness of the iPad when it comes down to inputting velocity and aftertouch data with MIDI notes in real time, there are still ways with which you can reliably trigger different velocities by relying on control schemes that take into account where the user taps a control object on the vertical axis or around a center point. I actually have an example to show this. Here I have a dedicated control surface just to trigger one sound, I'm sorry. And the closer I get to the center of the surface, as you can see, the light becomes brighter and brighter to signify that the velocity approaches the maximum value. I could also set this instrument for a mode where it would just simply respond to how high up I press my finger on the surface. The iPad also opens up the door to really break away from traditional piano keyboard style control surfaces. For example, it's very easy on the iPad to replace a conventional surface with an isomorphic virtual MIDI controller. Since the only physical part of the controller is actually the touchscreen, the fact that the rest of the controller is entirely virtual gives users an incredible level of flexibility and efficiency that is simply impossible on traditional hardware-based controllers. In many ways, this added flexibility can more than compensate for the drawbacks inherent to touchscreen-based virtual controller designs. This will only improve as people continue to uncover clever new ideas to leverage touchscreen technology in the context of electronic music production. So I can show you what I mean here exactly. For those who don't know what an isomorphic controller is, that's what that looks like. So this resembles what you would find, if you were to play a guitar. And the specificity is that regardless of the first note that I start tapping, if I want to trigger another note that is at a very specific interval in relation to that first note, on an isomorphic keyboard, I can always visually see what would be the pattern of the second note in relation to the first one. So for example, here I know that if I go 3 rows up and 3 positions to the right, I'm gonna hit the same note but 1 octave higher. And so this is something I can do regardless of what note I'm looking at, because there's a symmetry to this layout that is not existent, at least to that extent, in a typical piano style layout, such as this one. And even this is, not like a typical piano either. Being able to have access to triggering enough different notes at once is much more important to spark musical creativity than being able to accurately input the velocity details of a particular note played in real time, especially in the context of electronic music production, where there are many more ways than just velocity to bring expressiveness to a sound. It's still possible to achieve some level of real-time velocity detection by relying on the iPad's accelerometer, but this comes at the cost of significant added latency, so it's not currently viable in most important use cases, even though it's arguably still better than nothing. With everything I've covered throughout this talk, if you weren't already aware of the core meta implications of the technology surrounding the iPad Pro, in the context of electronic music production. I'm hoping this talk got you to a point where you're at least in a better position to evaluate and understand the appeal of an iPad Pro based setup on a deeper level. A lot of the ideas I've discussed are applicable in theory to any ultra low latency touchscreen based music instrument concepts, even though, if we're being realistic, the chances that a competitor would emerge seems unlikely to me at this point. I still wish things were different on that front though. Alright guys, that wraps up this video. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk and you've learned something useful that will potentially impact your approach making electronic music positively. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. It doesn't really cost you anything and it'll help my channel grow significantly. It'll also encourage me to continue making more videos. If you have any constructive comments or interesting relevant ideas you'd like to share, don't hesitate to leave a comment. There's no censorship on my channel for as long as the comments are remotely relevant and respectful, so feel free to write things that are more substantial if you'd like, without any risk of having your comments automatically censored silently. I've been on the receiving end of that automated moderation system, and I've chosen to deactivate that behavior on my channel because I don't want that system to discourage people from expressing their opinions freely on my channel. That's it for now, guys. Bye bye.